South Africa's legal case against Israel on the charges of genocide earlier this year has not only exposed the duplicity of international law and human rights, it has also revealed the cracks in the crumbling liberal world order. The systematic oppression, ethnic cleansing, and dehumanization of the Palestinian people has been an ongoing exercise of violence and power for decades. Zionist terrorism in Gaza has transgressed the thresholds of human sanctity, all while being broadcasted by trigger-happy soldiers who not only document their relentless assault on innocent civilians, but mockingly make light of their crimes on TikTok and Instagram. Israel has been deliberately targeting hospitals, mosques, churches, schools, and safe havens with impunity because the Western alliance supporting the occupation have done everything in their power to keep Israel above the law. That is, until the recent genocide in Gaza. The colonial alliance of the United States, the UK, the EU, Canada, and Australia, which for decades purported itself as the moral compass of humanity, has been exposed for what it truly is: a morally bankrupt hegemonic ring of organized crime built on the ruins of the civilizations they genocided. Let's take a deeper look. South Africa's case in the ICJ has not only threatened the colonial project, but was an unprecedented act of defiance in which the global South is putting Western standards of human rights and international law to the test. If we are in fact equal, then why is it that only Arabs and Africans die, whereas Israelis and other Europeans are killed? Why are innocent Ukrainian refugees running from war granted the utmost sympathy, attention, and support, and rightfully so, while thousands of starved and tortured refugees from the Middle East and Africa are left to freeze to death at the gates of Europe or drown at its shores? South Africa, like many other nations across Africa, carries generational wounds inflicted by European colonialism. As we know, the policy of apartheid was its most notable feature. An affluent white minority capitalized on the exploitation and dehumanization of a majority black population of South Africa. White South Africans were essentially the ruling class, dominating in the political, economic, and social arenas. South African citizens of color were subjected to a number of extremely racist policies. For example, the Population Registration Act of 1950 forced Black South Africans to register themselves based on their physical traits. According to this law, your social standing, political rights, economic prospects, and educational opportunities were entirely determined by your racial makeup. Or the Group Areas Act of 1950, which was effectively state-sanctioned racial segregation of non-white South Africans. Now, we all know the most iconic figure of the anti-apartheid movement. Yes, you guessed it, Nelson Mandela. However, surrounding this great man were a number of unsung heroes and heroines who were at the heart of bringing down apartheid in South Africa. One such figure was the anti-apartheid activist, Imam and preacher Abdullah Haroon. Imam Haron was born in Cape Town in 1924. Having lost his mother as an infant, he was raised by his aunt, whose influence inspired the young man to walk the path of sacred knowledge. The Imam pursued his religious training in Mecca under the tutelage of the renowned scholar Sheikh Abdurrahman al-Alawi al-Maliki. Upon his return to South Africa and continuing his religious studies, the Imam took it upon himself to care for the most destitute and needy in his community, especially those who had lost family members in fighting the apartheid regime. In 1955, he was appointed the Imam of Al-Jamia Mosque in Claremont, rising to prominence in his community as a leader despite his young age. As racial stratification continued to intensify, Imam Haron was one of the few vocal Muslim leaders at the time who not only preached against apartheid from the pulpit, but actively joined wider South African society in campaigning against the racist apartheid policies. An act of overt resistance that would come at a great personal cost. The 1960s for apartheid South Africa was marked by the intensification of racial segregation and violence. The Sharpeville massacre of 1960 was a bloody turning point in South African history, in which the police opened fire on peaceful protesters who had gathered to demonstrate against the forced racial segregation of Black and colored South Africans. In this callous display of violence, 69 innocent protesters were murdered and nearly 200 injured. Although Imam Haron was not present at Sharpeville, word of this brutal event reaffirmed his commitment to resistance. In May of 1961, Imam Haron delivered an impassioned speech, expressing his dissent against the Group Areas Act, saying, "These laws are a complete negation of the fundamental principles of Islam. They are designed to cripple us educationally, politically, and economically." The Imam himself, being a victim of this cruel law, was forcibly relocated from his home with his family. Despite this, his activism knew no bounds. Whilst traveling on pilgrimage to Mecca and Cairo, the Imam never missed an opportunity to support the anti-apartheid movement. He would meet with exiled anti-apartheid opposition leaders and even direct funds from supporters to provide financial support to the families of political prisoners. But at the heart of his activism, Imam Haron was truly the people's Imam. Whether it be the spiritual nourishment of his congregation or taking to the public square, the Imam empowered his people to resist through peaceful protests and fasting at a time when very few Muslim leaders had the courage to openly oppose their government. As the apartheid regime escalated its suppression of dissenting voices, it didn't take long for officials to take interest in his activism. Despite being urged by his inner circle to leave South Africa, he was unpersuaded. In the early hours of May 28, 1969, Imam Haron responded to the summons of the police security branch, unaware of the fate that lay before him. Upon his arrival, the notorious officer Spiker Van Wyk detained the Imam on the conspicuous charges of, yes, you guessed it, terrorism. Imam Haron was detained for 123 days, a period of time in which even his wife and children could not see him. On the 27th of September, 1969, at the age of 45 years old, Imam Haron was murdered in detention after inquiries of his passing revealed that he was tortured to death. In an attempt to explain the sudden death and the wounds sustained to his body, the police responsible for his death appallingly claimed that the Imam had fallen down the stairs. Doctors, lawyers, and police involved in this case lied to the courts about the torture Imam Haron endured, bringing forth the verdict that the Imam had died of a heart attack caused by falling down a flight of stairs. Despite his short life, Imam Haron wrote his name in the history of anti-apartheid resistance. Some 40,000 people, friends, family, supporters, and admirers attended the Imam's funeral. His sudden death traumatized South Africans of all faiths, for he was the first religious figure to have ever been killed by the murderous apartheid regime. Not only was the Imam a victim of this regime, he was also a victim of the fraudulent colonial criminal justice system that failed to grant him justice. In October of 2023, the Western High Cape Court put aside the rulings of the previous inquest into the Imam's death and ruled that he was indeed tortured to death. You heard that right. Over 50 years since his death and 30 years since the fall of the apartheid regime, steps to rectify Imam Haron's unjust death were finally taken. Although this great Imam did not live to witness the South Africa of his dreams, a nation free from its dark colonial history and white supremacy, Imam Haron stands as a testament to true faith and courage. A man who fearlessly looked tyranny in the eyes at a time when others dared not. Imam Haron's spirit of resistance continues to live on in the memory of South Africans, who today have taken up the mantle of justice and shown the world the true meaning of speaking truth to power.